thank you, everyone, and welcome to our final session. And really looking forward to this session. We thought we'd tackle this a little bit differently. We've got representatives from different disciplines and folks, unlike the majority of our previous panelists, not academics associated with a particular university, but folks from the media, government, and consulting here. And so Autumn Arnett's with Education Dive, which has been a part of this story too. They've been a follower of this institution, others that are trying to innovate and do things differently, and we're really grateful to have Autumn here, and Stephen Parker from the National Governors Association, one of our co-sponsors. Very grateful, Stephen, for that. And he's their legislative director, so he brings a wonderful perspective of both the executive branch and the legislative branch at the state level. And then we're grateful to have Dr. Paul Markham here, who is a founding partner of a very thoughtful, impressive higher ed consulting firm in the nation. And so what we've asked them to do is to listen carefully over the course of last night and today, and offer some thoughts about what they've heard, especially as that might translate into where we go next. It's wonderful that we've met. I think there's been a lot of enthusiasm here, but hopefully we'll do more than just pat ourselves on the back for some good conversations, and something from this will continue. Turn it over. We'll start with Autumn. And Autumn, what are you hearing? What are you thinking? What thoughts would you give us here as we wrap up?
So the one thing that I kept thinking about when I was listening to all of the panels today and yesterday was this idea of exit and on ramps, or on and off ramps, as being really the thing that attracted me in our first conversation to the idea of dual mission education. I live in an area where our highways kind of loop and they circle, and the ramps are all in all kinds of different shapes. And when you talk about student success and you think about the paths that so many students are taking, I think having a clear place where students can get on and off, can return, can maybe make 3 lefts and end up back on the highway is really important to the overall conversation of student success. I go a lot of places and higher ed leaders say, how can we improve? How can we do a better job of getting more students to and through? And my response is usually very cynical. And it's like, you don't want to. Higher education by nature is very exclusionary. It's intended not to. So I think the thing about dual mission education is it's the first model that I've really seen that I think really is very inclusive. It very much is focused around student success. It's very intentional about trying to get more students through. We talked a lot in the last couple of days about the idea of Harvard envy and how every institution wants to be the most prestigious, but no institutions are doing it very well, right? No institutions are getting students in and out at very high success rates. There was a report that came out from Third Way earlier this year that said when you look at all students, not just the first-time full-time enrollees, but when you look at all students enrolled, schools actually do a worse job than we think they do at getting students in and out. And I think part of that is, part of it is because of the shell game where you admit you're challenging students in the spring so that they don't count in the cohort. But part of it is also because we don't look at higher education as a whole continuum where students may have needs that change or interests that change, or maybe a student came in, like they said on the last panel, maybe a student came in really wanting to go into nursing and thinking that was the only thing for them. But when they get 3 semesters in and realize maybe nursing isn't for them, then they feel like they have to completely start over. So the great thing about dual mission education and having the on and off and the flexibility is that it really is way more adaptable to today's students, I think.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity to be here. It is an honor to be able to partner with you all on this event. So first, a little bit about the National Governors Association. We are the collective voice of the nation's governors. Our primary responsibilities are to be the interface between governors and the federal government, and we also help states do things better in their states and learn from other states through best practices. One thing that we say at NGA all the time, and you'll find it to be true if you visit any governor's website in the country, and that is every governor considers themselves a jobs governor. And they put everything in economic development terms. And what we're also saying is that in order to be a jobs governor, every governor has to be an education governor. And as we move into this next phase of jobs and we think about the future of work, what governors are thinking about in the job space more than anything else is disruption. And in order for that disruption to take the state economy in an appropriate direction, we also have to think about what disruption looks like in the education space, particularly the higher education space. As governors look at ballooning student debt, we are increasingly having conversations with them about what they can do to help. And as we think about what the potential of the dual mission model means, we also think about the fact that we only have 19 states that are undertaking this. And the opportunity that we see this year is this. 39 governors' elections are taking place in November. We are expecting 18 new governors. And this may be incredibly boring to you, but we actually have gone and looked at all 212 candidate websites and what they say about education, and here's what we found. The number one thing mentioned across all the 212 candidates who are running for governor in 39 states is K-12 financing. Obviously important, but not relevant to our conversation. Number two is early childhood education. Number three is innovation in universities and the rising cost of college tuition. And as we think about what dual mission model means, and as I think about the presentation that I saw from President Holland last night, where for less than $12,000, a student can come and get an associate's degree here or a master's degree, that is the type of model that governors are looking for. But it's becoming increasingly difficult. I am a product of the community college system in Virginia. I had no options when it came to finances for college until I visited my local community college and they told me that a Pell Grant was available, and that covered the entire cost of college, of my first 2 years of college for me. And it left me enough money for transportation, and it left me enough money for books and supplies and all of those things. I was able to live. Students who go to that same community college now, 16 years later, 17 years after I started, that doesn't even come close to covering the cost of college. And so as we think about what we're doing with dual mission, we also have to think about how much it costs and how much that cost will grow or shrink if we do expand out into a baccalaureate direction. And so one of the things that I saw, and one of the things that we've seen internally in NGA, is the higher education staff at NGA that has worked on dual mission, going back all the way to 2012 when I tried to get this done in Virginia with the governor's office, and when a year ago when Illinois tried to get this done, we saw that all of the experience in DC, if anybody worked with higher education, they have experienced pushback against this model. The politics of this model are complex, as we've talked about. But from a governor's perspective, we believe that January 2019 is a huge opportunity. This is low-hanging fruit for governors. This is low-hanging fruit for new governors. If you campaigned on college affordability, this is a turnkey option for college affordability the minute you come in. And it's not going to cost your state money. In the long term, it's going to make your state money. And it's going to give you more resources to do good in your state. And so there's a lot more to say, but I hope that the dialogue that we have, we can get into a little bit more of the opportunities following this convening.
I created an on-the-fly PowerPoint deck here, so let's see when that starts. Tell me if you can see it. There we go. Okay, so just a little bit of context about me and where I come from, so you sort of have the background from my comments. So first of all, most people want to know what my accent is. Where do you think I'm from? Let me stop. Where do you think I'm from? Kentucky. It used to even sound like you don't even know how to say Kentucky. Yeah, right. Yeah, most people get confused. They get Texas, right, or something. No. Kentucky, fifth-generation dairy farmer. So the kinds of students that we talk about when we're in meetings like this, that's me, right? And so I've never left that. I'm still deeply rooted in that. I live in D.C., but I've not forgotten that, when I was growing up, you worked on the farm or worked in the factory. That was it, right? And so I actually did that. Was fortunate enough to have parents that said, the economy is not going to hold up. And it didn't for family farmers. I did go to college, Western Kentucky University, got an engineering degree. I was ultimately a process engineer and a quality assurance manager in industry. designing processes and helping increase productivity in manufacturing. So when I had this long story of going back to school, and I just wanted to affect change for people like me from places I came from, and immediately figured out after talking to folks and observing, education was a way to do it. So first of all, you should, as an observation, you should know that. I know it's been said in different ways, but whether you recognize it each day or not, you all have a social justice or a social change dimension to your work. You just do, right? Because education is the biggest lever we have for that in this country and in this world. So you're to be commended for that before anything else, right? And so for me, then, after working in universities, I worked with community colleges and ASCU schools, which I know UVU is an ASCU institution, and working in open and broad access student success efforts for some time. Ended up at the Gates Foundation, so the work on pathways, the pathways in developmental education reform was my portfolio. So I've been super pleased with what's happened in the last several years with that work. It's now proper to say that, for sure, in the community college space, that is a legitimate national movement, right? And so I've sort of told, this is not going to be a secret anymore, Jessica. I've told her to, like, this. You're in a really interesting spot, because coming from Walla Walla, Washington State, heavily involved in pathways, and now at a school like Utah Valley, a really important place to make those connections, to build on it. And so I was a part of that work, then a vice president of Achieving the Dream. So I've seen the highest performing community colleges across the country do all sorts of things. And then ultimately, after I left the foundation in ATD, the same thing came up. No matter what project I was on or what grant it was under or whatever, I always was doing some work on implementation, right? The human side. So Stephen Wrigley was up here this morning and said the human side of change, and that's actually part of the tagline that we use. You can't avoid it, right? So it was the way that things were implemented, where everything would rise or fall on that. And so my business partner and I said, well, why don't we just do that rather than sort of hiding that in the cracks and crevices? So that's where SOVA came from. And we've worked in over half the states in the country on very ambitious student success initiatives. Now, I should say, coming into this, this has been a great experience. I'm a shameless learner. I mean, I just never. I always want to learn wherever I go, and I've learned a lot today. Because when I came in, I thought, this is what is dual mission? It's like, what does that really mean? And I've at first thought it was about the technical or logistical aspects around merger acquisition issues. You've got a community college, you've got a university, and you've got to figure out how to do that. That is hard work. We've supported some of that work in the field, and there's lots of business issues around it. But it didn't take me long to figure out what you're really talking about student success here. It's Utah's, it's distinctive in this context, way of leveraging your community college and your university systems to help students achieve what they want to achieve. So I'm excited, actually, about this conversation. It's been helpful to me to learn the different perspectives that you're coming from. I think you've got opportunities here that are phenomenal. So regardless of where you are, and I loved Sarah's comment this morning about I don't know if she's still here, but the spectrum of the dual mission, from just having articulation agreements to what transitions from community colleges to universities. Now, I can't see it. This is going to be challenging. These are also my notes, so I can see what I say here. I think I can see that. So not every state will have to deal, of course. These are some key observations I'm making, again, against the work that we're doing nationally. Not everybody will have to deal with dual mission as you describe it here. But I feel very confident in saying every state does have to deal with student success, because the way I like to talk about it is if it's not in your heart, If you're an institutional leader or a faculty member and then this mission is not in your heart, it better be in your mind and pretty close to the top of mind, because it's a business issue for you, right? And that's the fact of the matter. And so you have a strong point of traction here in the way that you're working. One thing that I notice is that when we look at student success efforts across the country, Pathways being one example, there's a lot of effort put into reducing or eliminating transition points, anywhere there's gaps. It strikes me that you, again, by model, have a strong advantage in that, because you've cut out, some number of transition points. And I love RDC's sort of line this morning, this narrative around where students were leaving and they weren't coming back. Well, you have a strong foothold to address that by design. So that strikes me as very important. And I'm sort of squinting to see this, but so institutions and systems working on this, it's also giving you a way to talk about very innovative change that's not happening in other places. I really want to stress this for just a moment. So dual mission, but sort of technically the combining of community colleges and university, that shouldn't necessarily have to have anything to do with competency-based education, credit for prior learning, or any of those things that have been mentioned from the stage, concerned with equity issues, but they've all been mentioned here. So this is giving you it's an impetus to deal with issues that are actually on the cutting edge of higher education nationally. So I'm finding that very impressive, and a strong opportunity for you to lean even more heavily into that. Let's see, so some key challenges. Let me see here that as I've been listening. I've heard it referenced here, and it's certainly the case across the country, where you're having to deal with community college students and university students. It should not be. Let me just say, I believe it should not be an area of deep contention or concern, but it is, right? And so this issue of student dignity, of students seeing themselves and how they might even feel, whether you are intentionally creating an atmosphere or not, where community college students or those coming in underprepared and not yet in a four-year program would feel like a second-class citizen when others are the best and the brightest, is an issue. We did we've done a ton of work across the country with students and with Ivy Tech system, and particularly Ivy Tech system in Indiana, where we had focus groups at every one of their institutions, over 40 institutions. And when students would struggle and disappear for whatever reason, they would drop out, not come back, stop out. I guess just sort of naive assumption was, when we talked to those students, what they would say is, the school just wasn't giving me what I needed, or if they should have got their act together and this or that. But that's not what happened. Across the board, students would say, I was worried that I just wasn't college material. I was worried I just wasn't smart enough. I guess I'm not, right? And so that is still, to tell it, is heartbreaking, because students more often than not blame themselves for not finding their way through. And so anything that contributes to the notion that they are not good enough for something that's better, which was maybe is the four-year side of the house or the work, I think is difficult for students. And just, there's a lot been said here about addressing that and making sure that doesn't happen. But we've heard it over and over across the country. It's just so important to keep sort of the dignity of the students in focus. The top question, Craig, I think, is that, your Senate Chair, the top question, hands down, across the country, on anything, whether it's called dual mission or something else, is, what do we do with faculty? How do we get faculty on board or involved in this? So you're not alone. You're not alone in that concern or in those comments. One thing I'll say, and if we want to talk about this in questions, I can definitely come back to it. But so I was the chair of a large faculty senate at one point, and that experience, together with what I've now seen across the country, I think like shared governance will only get us part way there. Where we've seen the best outcomes is not necessarily through shared governance or shared decision making, but actually faculty co-ownership of the work, which is not, so faculty co-ownership of your improvement efforts is not the same thing as shared governance, right? They have to be related, but it takes extra engagement to have faculty as co-owners. And let's see, attention to equity. I'll just for the sake of time, just mention that that must be done. That's something that's more and more pressing. There are ways to improve, quote, your outcomes, but by falling short with what your students that are most at risk need, right? And this attention to the human side of change simply just can't be avoided. So this is my last major point here, and I'm going to be quiet, and if we want to talk about some things and questions, I'm happy to. So this little spectrum, I just sketched this at the bottom of the slide here. A lot of this has been couched in the language of access, but the sort of nationally, there's a continuum of this. There's access, completion, and then ultimately student success. And student success meaning, it's not just enough to have a credential, but a credential that leads to something, right? To a job with labor market value and so forth, meaningful spot in your community. Where issues are being increasingly addressed on access, and some would say we've won that one. We are open access. Anyone that wants to come can come. That is not the same thing as having the kind of supports in place for students when they show up, right? To make sure they go from having come in the door to actually completing and finding themselves to the place they want to be and to fulfill the reason that they came. That is the true rising tide of concern nationally, is once the students are with you, how are you redesigning your institution in a very specific, thoughtful way? And this is, Jessica, what Pathways is about in the community college sector, is it's institutional transformation from a comprehensive point of view. I think I do have one more thing here, but yep. Okay, just thoughts for moving forward. Well, I don't know if you can see that, but I'll actually just leave that up there because I've exceeded my time, and then speak to these in sort of question and answer. If you don't mind me doing that, President Hall.
Yeah, that'll be fine. So I've got a couple of questions I want to direct here, and then we'll open it up. Something you said, Paul, triggered a thought about a couple of other comments that have been made. This is more about, I think, rhetoric than substance, but I think it's at least seems an important question to me, which is this language we're using of dual mission model. I mean, does that make sense to people? Does it communicate something? Some people have suggested, well, maybe outside of Utah it doesn't, and others seem to know it and it means something. So Autumn, I'm curious, from a journalist perspective, is this language that is getting used more broadly in the national conversation? If not, should it be used, or is there a different nomenclature? What are you, maybe have you and Paul respond on that, and then I have a related question for Stephen.
So I have not seen this as language that's being used broadly. I think the language that a lot of people are using are around micro-credentials or stackable credentials and how we can create different levels of credentials. And you usually see that from four-year institutions that are now trying to figure out how to go back and serve either adult learners or students who may have dropped out, have some college and didn't finish. But the conversation around dual mission specifically is not something that I've seen outside of actually here. To your question of whether it should be something that we're using more, I think that depends on state. I think different places and different people take mission to mean different things, but certainly the conversation of how to look at education as a whole spectrum, as a continuing lifelong learning enterprise, rather than as something you come on and get a 2-year or a 4-year and then you keep it moving. One thing though, I was at AACC, the community colleges meeting a couple of weeks ago, and one thing one chief business officer said that makes good common sense, but I couldn't believe he said it in public, was that the completion agenda goes kind of against the business agenda, which is, in his state, there aren't enough students graduating high school to recruit. So if you bring them on and you try to push them through in X number of years, then you lose that enrollment money, right? You lose the tuition dollars. So the completion agenda kind of goes against the funding agenda. But I think one thing, again, about this continuing pathways conversation that makes a lot of sense is you can have students who may come in and get a need met and then go out and live a little life and get some experience, find that they have a new need, and because of the relationship they already had with your institution and because of the way that they see the ease of on and off ramps. I really like the on and off ramp analogy. I live in the DC area. So the way that they see the ease of the on and off ramps come, especially with first generation students or low income students, where the high touch individual point of contact, someone to ask very specific questions and know who that person is that you can go to. I think particularly for those students, that makes a lot of sense. So they would have already had a relationship with you because they came for a certificate or because they came for an associate's or even a bachelor's. And now that they're in another place in life and realize that they need a new credential, they can go and ask the same person their questions and just know where to take those.
Yeah, good. Paul, you want to chime in on this?
Oh, absolutely. So this is new to me too. Dual mission language. I think that, so let me start on the one end is that I think that the language is problematic in the sense that I know that you don't mean you actually have two missions. I know your mission is student success. But if it's a dual mission, then what is the what are these these two? Is there how should I think about the two different types of students or something? So it's problematic on that end. But let me just be quick to say though, I don't know what's better because I've spent a good amount of time I was looking so forward to Millie being here, so because we were going to spar on this, but so pathways is not exactly getting traction among the ASCU sector because, I hear from a lot of provosts and presidents, well, that's far too narrow. That's about completer degrees and, and cert programs. And we need something much more holistic. So while dual mission is not something that's widespread across the country from at least my experience and may have some baggage with it, there's nothing, I can't offer anything much better at the moment.
Yeah. I wonder if, Ann, I don't know if you or Paul or this is language we've been using for a while. Do you have any thoughts on that as we've reflected and heard? I'm sort of putting you on the spot there, but.
I don't have a better term. I think dual mission. Thank you. I think dual mission at least communicates that we are trying to do both the community college mission and the teaching university mission and integrate that. And I have heard people talk about things like the Metropolitan University. Most of you may not be around long enough to know that, but there was a time that we tried using that term to kind of focus on that broader kind of relevancy piece, et cetera. So I've seen people try to find the right term, and at least this communicates we're trying to integrate both of them together. But I think it might be nice for us to think about how do we do a branding strategy here. Because one of the things that struck me about this conversation over the last day and a half is that And Sarah, I'm with many of you. Sarah's comments were really helpful because I think you could see we are moving from community college, moving into that university piece, but we're also seeing it happening from universities then being pushed together with community college. We're seeing this happen from both ends of the spectrum, and then you see everything along this spectrum. So I think it's going to be an emerging model and probably take greater relevance over time just because people are doing it for different reasons, whether they're trying to meet regional needs or whether they're saying, we just have to marry this because resources are getting tight and we don't have as many students and it doesn't make sense for us to kind of not bring these things together. So maybe we need to think about how do we brand this and engage a lot of institutions who are in this milieu together.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Stephen, in a way that can follow on with that, you've talked about this as low-hanging fruit as you think about going back to governors and new governors. Is this, is the dual mission language the language to use? And if so, or if not, what are things that folks here in a room like ourselves, how could we be of help to you or governors or others to help promote the model and help people understand its virtues on that more national political scale?
Sure. So we're going to skip ahead a little bit. I actually had recommendations for all of you that I was going to talk about at the end, but we'll talk about one of them now. My old boss at the National Governors Association, whenever we started a legislative or policy strategy meeting, and there was something new on the table, he would say this to me: find your bumper sticker. Find your bumper sticker. You have to figure out your bumper sticker for dual mission, and dual mission on its own is not a bumper sticker. I had never heard of dual mission before until the reporter who was here from the Chronicle did a video interview with you in 2015, 2016. I'd never heard of it before that point. But I did know what I did know what a baccalaureate granting community college was. But I would say from my perspective, I was skeptical of that term until I got here, and I have, like all great politicians, I have evolved over the past 24 hours. And I'll say what really did it for me was the three presentations last night. I get it now. It's a perfect encapsulation of everything you're trying to do. For the number one hit on those states that have tried to get this done in their own backyards and failed is that you're going to lose your emphasis on being a community college. You're going to lose your emphasis on open doors, all these things that we've talked about. But you know what? Dual mission, just by simply calling it that, takes those fears away. You don't change your mission, you add another one. And so I think a lot of education needs to be done. I would not change this at all, but a lot of education needs to be done on what you all can do to briefly encapsulate what dual mission means. Because you know what? After spending the last 24 hours here, it is not a baccalaureate granting community college. It's not. And you know what? I would guess that there's a great Pew story from April of this year that talks about all the states that have baccalaureate granting community colleges. Utah, they refer to them as one. I would gather that essentially a lot of the institutions that they classify as that actually are dual mission. And I think that the conversation around dual mission cannot end in this room. You all have built a coalition over the past 24 hours, and those conversations need to continue, but that's a spoiler. We'll get to that later.
Good. Well, listen, it sounds like we got a few more things to present in terms of next steps from some of our panelists, but before we go to that, are there questions from the floor for the panelists before we have them do that? What's that? Okay, you want to jump right to that? Okay, well let's go.
I'm sorry, I don't want to hog the mic, but let me just say this: I actually had no plans to lay out these 5 recommendations, one of which I just gave you, until about 2 hours ago when I started listening to things. At the same time, the presentation this morning was happening on what was happening in states. I got an email from my community college president, with the community college where I went, and he asked me for a copy of a commencement speech. It was a commencement speech that I gave last year to the 1,300 graduates of my community college, and the title of it was "How to Run the World and Be Genuinely Kind to Everyone You Meet." And I used it. I basically had laid out recommendations based on DC strategy. But I'm going to turn them around, and I gave them life advice based on these recommendations, but I think based on everything I've heard here today, it fits. So the first one is find your equalizer, and I think you've already done that. The two biggest problems today, at least from the DC perspective, which is the one that I bring here today, is that we have a problem with access and we have a problem with completion. Models like those in place at UVU, like those in place at Valencia, like those in place at Lake Area Technical College in South Dakota, those are models that address the access question, the cost question, and the completion question. You all, and the models that you all use at your institutions, if you put them up against even some flagship institutions in this country when it comes to completion, particularly Pell completion, low-income completion, I would venture to say that you all are close to those flagship institutions, if not surpassing some of them, right? So I think your equalizer is that. You all are doing things better than many of the institutions in this country using a streamlined model that's affordable. That maybe is your bumper sticker. The next piece is build a coalition. That is what you all have done here today. This should not be one of those conferences where you all come in and have great conversations about what you're all doing, and then go home and talk about what happened with all of the folks back at your institutions and how there are other people in the United States doing this, and it's a great idea and we should continue doing what we're doing. If you all want this model to expand, if you all want disruption that you all have created in this room to continue into those 32 states, 31 states that have not yet done this, you all are going to have to continue to work together. You're going to have to continue to coordinate, and you're going to have to continue to communicate as one voice about the importance of this issue. And you don't all have to do it in person. You can do it by helping out your other colleagues who are not in this room who have tried to do this. If you go to Google News and you search for bachelor's degree in community college, you're going to have to sift out some things, but the thing that you'll find that I found this morning is this, and that is so many people have tried this and failed. They need your help. They need to figure out how to do this in a way that works for them and figure out the message that's ultimately going to work for them. There's another thing here, which is refuse to let fear dominate you. You told a story of an institution across the river that's a four-year institution that, said to you in very plain terms, don't change what you're doing. Keep doing what you're doing. Don't infringe on our territory. That is exactly what so many who have tried to do this and failed have run into. Strategies for how to get past all of the rocks and stones that have been thrown at this model are things that you all need to discuss. That is actually one area that I don't think we fully uncovered over the past 24 hours. And that's something that we all need to explore together, and it's going to look different in every state. The fourth thing is this, and really this is the last thing since I've already given you one of the recommendations, and that's this. If history repeats itself, then make sure that it's the history you want. And I think for dual mission and for baccalaureate granting community colleges, this is probably the most critical piece, because you all are making a case for why this is a better model than some of the four-year institutions and a model that's going to fill the gaps. Four-year institutions are widely criticized as being broken. Not all of them, not the entire system, but there are obviously pockets of institutions that are not doing things particularly well for students, or at least the students who need help the most. There is an equity problem in higher education right now, and that equity problem extends long beyond when that student graduates. It extends into their lifetime because of college debt. If you all are truly going to be those disruptors, you need to look at history, you need to look at data, and make sure that you all are addressing problems on the front end of this model, because you all are on the front end of this model, to make sure that you all don't turn into the four-year institutions that have not done particularly well. And then the last one is find your bumper sticker. And we still have some work to do on that.
Great, thank you. Paul?
So is there a way to switch back to the PowerPoint? Because I'm just going to stand up and so I can see what I said. I would see what I said. Isn't this a shame? So is this okay if I stand?
Yeah,
okay,
absolutely.
I'm sorry.
But please sing.
Sorry. Yeah, so it's a new. I can't see from all the way back there. That's what I'm doing. So so our work is on the ground in institutions that are trying to make these changes. So I think this actually fits very well, Stephen, with sort of this these sort of global concerns you're going to have to worry about on the policy level, and I think you'll see some definite sort of how this is complementary. So knowing your why, I love again, it was the RDC's message this morning. In any of the ambitious student success work, if you don't anchor first on the why and the values behind it, you're going to be adrift at some point. You become unmoored, right? Because once you get sort of hung up into all the issues that concern faculty, as they should, deeply, going back to the why you're doing this gives you it's your docking station. It's your reset point, right? And so making sure that you have I think maybe that's the bumper sticker version. It's why are you doing this? What problem is it solving? This is, I think, a particularly relevant one for the dual mission model. Is this: be careful not to create a teaching versus research dichotomy. There are places where you don't. So it's to care about teaching is not the same thing as not to care about research, right? It doesn't have to be that. I mean, there are great models of institutions who do research, but they do research on effective teaching, for example, right? And so it's creating cultures of innovation among their faculty, not because they're not doing research, but they're doing research that makes their teaching better, right? And so there's no need to create a dichotomy that's going to be trouble, especially for faculty. Special attention to equity gaps. I feel like, this is that's been very well articulated in your panel, Kyle. The bottom line on that is disaggregate data. I think is really it, because you got to know who's being affected. Jessica, I love your stat. If you would have made would have been a subtle change here, look at who was affected at the end of the day. It's a big deal. And if you don't disaggregate data, you won't know that. Get ahead on transfer. So so we were working with a CUNY system in New York and Batesville in Arkansas, right? So I was just in Batesville last week, and so even where there are articulation agreements and you would think, well, this shouldn't students have all their credits preserved and all that? And no, they're not, right? Even when you're a part of the same system as students, because the issue is junior standing in a major, right? It's not just being accepted. So making sure that you deal with the transfer issue explicitly, because just sort of general articulation agreements will not deal with the issues that program level faculty have, right? You got to be able to deal with that as well. And then last one is be super clear about what you mean by student-centered design. I've heard that term several times. I think it's exactly the right term, but be cautious about what you mean by that, because that means you actually have to know, if you make changes, is it helping your students? And so the questions that follow is, how do we know that it's helping our students? So you have to have processes in place to know if you make this change, something is changing for students. We do. It's the program that got us to Batesville, where we go into colleges that are doing pathways and other kinds of comprehensive changes, and we always begin with the president and his cabinet, and hear about all the changes that have been made. And it's, I would say, 80-20, like 80% being, this is fantastic, 20% here's a few problems. But as we move through the faculty and to the students, often, not all the time, but very often, the students will say, I'm just totally lost. I don't, and so we don't say, we just listen to them, but then we get to go back and say, well, we know you're doing this, but but your students don't see it that way. And so when you are building student-centered systems and overhaul, make sure you're building ways to actually listen to students, right? To know if what you are doing is having its intended effect. So thank you for letting me stand up.
You're welcome. You can sit down now. Autumn, anything you want to say in a wrap up here in terms of our next steps moving forward?
As a journalist, I would just say control the narrative. To tie back into LeVar Burton's comments and even Stephen's comments about find your bumper sticker. I think whether it's with faculty, who I think everyone knows that it's nice to say that we're going to be completely student-centered and faculty have to get on board, but when faculty start complaining, that's when accreditors come knocking on your door to check up. So you want to make sure that you're controlling the narrative with faculty members and making sure that they're really on board and a part of the conversations as you're considering these models and considering changing. You want to control the narrative with students and families, prospective and current, just to make sure that there's no concern about loss of mission and about compromise and about what does this mean for me and my household. You want to make sure that you're controlling the narrative with alumni and donors. In Georgia, the conversations with merging institutions, they didn't close any, but there's been a whole lot of backlash about, like he said, the name changes and the colors, and even like one word in a mission statement that was in one institution, so it's not in the new institutions. So making sure that you're communicating with donors and stakeholders on the front end, but also throughout the process, so that it doesn't become this firestorm where alumni are revolting because your colors are no longer green and gold, over something that really would benefit the actual community. You don't want to get your alumni storming to the State House saying what a terrible idea this thing that you're trying to do is, because that could completely undo any progress. And then control the narrative with media and with legislatures and with the public in general. I think the public in general hates higher education right now, but if we could figure out how to do it and how to communicate it in a way that makes it a public good and not a private commodity, then I think we can get more support, more public support, more money, more funding to be able to do things, to drop tuition, to be able to innovate, to be able to travel to events and learn from peers. Because I think more than the AACC meeting or, the big meetings, being able to come to settings like this and have very highly collaborative conversations about best practices and things that you can take back and share challenges is really important.
Great, thank you. Follow-on questions from any of that from the audience? There's a lot of meat there that you've given us to think about. We've only got about 15 minutes, so I'll let that question stand. But also let me just open it up to the floor. All of you, or at least most of you, have a couple of things written down in front of you. I'd love to hear from at least some of you as we wrap up here, your thoughts about anything that we didn't address, or thoughts about next steps, where we go from here. Who would be willing to share something with us that you wrote down?
Thank you, ma'am. Long arms.
Yeah.
It's great. I'd love to hear more about accreditation. Our institutions in Arkansas are HLC based, and I know there are different accrediting entities around this country, and I'd love to compare and contrast how accreditors look at dual mission in relation to faculty credentialing, the institution itself, and the pathways that institutions have the ability to pursue for accreditation. Being an old researcher, I'd love to see more in the future as we all go forward, some outcomes and results in relation to how students are progressing through dual mission institutions. Are they being placed in a greater way as far as work? Are they transitioning on to a bachelor's, and if they are, what's their GPA? Are they continuing on in a very positive manner? So those are some, and of course finances. How do we finance two institutions coming together? And again, in varying state models, in a performance-based funding model, in an enrollment model, and combinations thereof. I think that'd be fascinating to look at.
Thank you. I am looking at a couple of folks on my team. I don't know if Jeff and Linda would you either of you want to take 30 seconds on Northwest and our relationship on accrediting and our mission. Any thoughts on that?
Thank you. Our Northwest is just getting into the publication of outcomes measures for the whole system, the 7 states that are covered there. But they're doing it in a gentle way in the sense that they are saying we recognize that every institution has its own mission and role. And so they are saying, yes, if you're an open admission institution, you are going to have a lower rate than a highly selective institution. So they're letting us provide some narrative around that. We haven't written narrative yet, but that's the signaling so far. And they, of course, though, are subject to NASIKI and others where we have some thresholds. So we've all got to watch out for really low completion rates, but they're not getting out a stick over those yet. So we're grateful for that in the Northwest region. For institutions, so the comment about community colleges offering bachelor's degrees. In our region, I think they probably called out Snow College, that's offering 1 or 2 bachelor's degrees. But for Dixie, Weber, and UVU, we are 4-year institutions. And so that's how our accrediting body treats us, is as 4-year institutions. We do not have specific standards regarding faculty credentialing other than we have to tell our story around what our credentials are. And so it's the evaluator team that comes in. But, we don't have faculty. We have faculty in some disciplines, like culinary arts, that may not have bachelor's degrees. But faculty that are in science are going to generally have doctoral degrees. So it varies across campus, and we've not gotten any negative feedback over our history. And I don't know if Weber State has a different history or Dixie State.
Okay, thank you, Linda. Anything, other things from the floor? A question, thought about next steps, where we go from here? Yes.
Re-envision that so that general education meets the needs of the 21st century, where students need to focus much more on critical thinking skills, on teaching themselves, on being able to sort through the massive information that is available, how they can effectively communicate. Those sorts of things that are traditionally the role of general education, but have really been transformed, and yet it seems that our general education oftentimes is still pretty much what it was 20, 30 years ago. And how does that fit within a dual
I guess
mission
that's
institution?
my follow-on question. Do you see something there being affected by the dual mission as in the ways that we think about that?
Well, that oftentimes we look at general education as cutting across the two missions that are there, that it is really a single kind of program. Oftentimes the idea that, for instance, with an associate degree, that students do their general education and then they're done, and then from that point on, they're focused on their major, whether they're getting an associate degree or whether they go on to a bachelor's degree. Once they've completed that associate's degree, general education is, in a sense, a thing of the past. And yet the way we tend to envision general education now is something that pervades the educational model and extends beyond into true lifelong learning. And how does that fit within a dual mission education role?
I'm not prepared to answer whether general ed is horizontal or a sunburst, but you're onto something important. I know that. Yeah. So. Good, thank you. Yes, Anne, please.
So I'd be interested. I'd be interested in whether it would be helpful if, in 18 months, 2 years, we continued this conversation and we focused on maybe some of the things that have been brought out that we didn't take a deeper dive into. Around accreditation issues and how we deal with that, around funding models, which which we kind of hit on, but we focused on really more outcomes than some of those pieces. Would that be kind of a useful kind of convening of institutions that are doing this kind of thing, so we could have some deeper dive conversations?
Well, let's just have a raise of hands. Who would be in favor of another summit in 18 months to 2 years to kind of explore all this again? So, okay, the rest of you are invited to leave. that I think that's a great suggestion. Yeah, David.
One of the things that maybe one of the things that could help us a little bit is if we can get some more of our great research universities to do some more analysis of what's happening in this, and here we are in this space. Sarah referred to the University of Florida report, and of course that's in Florida, so they focused on our institutions, but it really focused on a number of the questions that keep getting raised around this, and whether they're policy papers that could help the Stevens of the world with the governors, and policy papers that could be commissioned by various policy analyst groups that looks at the actual data of what is happening with these models could be helpful to a variety of different policymakers in particular, I think, if not institutions looking at these different models.
If I could just, research institutions are great, and if they'll do it for you, that's amazing. But you should also look to national think tanks who have some skin in this game, those who are looking for better completion outcomes. I mean, while they may be a little bit more biased than research institutions, I think a lot of those studies can happen a lot quicker when they're outside the academic setting. And there are also lots of private consulting firms who have a lot to gain by something like this happening, who can be helpful in kind of facilitating that research. So I'd expand, your search for data and reports outside the research university realm.
Stephen, are there any in particular that come to mind that you would think we would start with, or? So
in North Carolina, there's a nonprofit called the James G. Martin Institute. They look a lot at, they're more right-leaning. They look a lot at college completion and the value of high quality, low cost options for students in the higher education space. They had this great blog post that is more focused on community colleges, but they actually wasn't a blog post. It was a report that was published earlier this year talking about the value of community colleges to conservatives and options for using them as incubators of innovation. And then on the other side of the spectrum, the New America Institute in Washington, D.C. is fantastic. They are bipartisan most of the time, but they're known as being left of center. They are voraciously writing about completion models, and they've started to recently delve into competency-based education. I think this is a logical next step to kind of talk about what this model brings as far as affordability and access. So those are just two options. There are tons of options out there that you can jump into and see if they would be willing to write some things for you and look into this a little bit more.
Excellent, thank you. Yes, Scott.
So I'm in my role as a dean at Weber State University, Dean of Arts and Humanities, and this term dual mission was used a lot. I've only been there for 2 years. So in the second year, I started thinking about what that meant. And so I automatically went to the Carnegie classifications thinking it would be there. And it's not. And I'm wondering what it takes to classify a university in the Carnegie classification, because then you would get traction with this model. If it clearly is a different model from everything else that exists, that should be recognized somehow. I don't know how you get in there, but it seems like that might be something interesting over time.
It would certainly, if it were, and Carnegie's probably would be the lead candidate, but something consortium of national stature like that starts to use the nomenclature, that would go a long ways. So
I had another comment, and that is the intangible part of the dual mission, and that is it reminds me of a study by William Bowen called Lesson Plan. He was the head of the Mellon Foundation for several years, and he wrote a recent book talking about all things equal. If you put a student in a community college and you put them in a four-year institution, you're going to get a higher completion rate with a four-year institution. And there are lots of different reasons, and they've been mentioned here. One of them is eliminating the transitions and all that. But he also talks about the sort of social or mimetic dimension of human behavior. You're around people with aspirations beyond the community college, and it kind of lifts you along. So I wonder if the outcome rates of the dual mission university are higher than, say, California, not for all these other reasons, but also because they're in classes with students who are seeking four-year degrees, and they see it's not that big of a deal, and maybe if they had doubts about themselves, they're able to self-assess and say, oh, I could do that too. Yeah. So there's a sort of a hidden, intangible social dimension that might be a benefit that we could be talking about.
I think that's an excellent point. That's one of the points I was going to make, and given where we are on the time, I'll just jump in on that with Scott to say part of my journey here in a fairly late-breaking way, already having been committed to the dual mission and seen all of its virtues, took on a new dimension when I went away for a brief sabbatical to Oxford this last summer. And I went with two objectives. I was trying to dust off my old academic chops and do a project on Jefferson and Madison and some of they had some transatlantic correspondence when Jefferson was in Paris and Madison was in America, talking about the issue of freedom and future generations. And I figured Jefferson writing from Paris, Madison, America, I'd go to England to figure out what they were all about. And so that was the primary research project, but I put as a secondary project, I wanted to, write about this dual mission model. And I was just so taken back by the fact that I'd get in these faculty conversations in these Oxford circles, and they would they might start with Jefferson and Madison and the founding and history and philosophy and politics, but they would almost always end about, now, what is this thing you're doing at UVU? And very shortly, I was getting connected with people all over the place, and it was clear that England was grappling with these very issues in maybe an even more intense way than we are right here. And it didn't take me long to figure out that a lot of it was connected to Brexit. And one of the things that I was turned on to was a book by David Goodhart called The Road to Somewhere. And he's actually an expert on immigration and was wrestling with the Brexit issue and trying to sort through what had happened there. And his conclusion was that it was actually almost, I don't know, maybe a slight overstatement, but strongly driven by the educational process in England. And that the problem that they had there is that they have so bifurcated vocational and career and technical education and training and academic training that they've just created two dramatically different worlds culturally within their own country. And so and his thesis is, if you've got a university degree, you have a degree to anywhere. You are trained to think critically. You've got all these higher order skills that allow you to kind of progress on up through the ranks, if you will, of the corporate world. And you're introduced to difference and complexity and cosmopolitanism. And so you are perfectly comfortable, if you get a university degree in England, when you're finished, to go over to the continent and work, go over to America and work. You can move and do wherever you want. You've got a ticket to anywhere. By contrast, he says, we have so narrowly focused our career and technical training and our career training and our trades. We haven't invested in them. We haven't valued them. And that is a ticket to somewhere. And usually that somewhere is your own backyard. It's the town you grew up in with a job that's designed around a very specific something. And so that's the road to somewhere. Now, if you're in the road to anywhere, the European Union and the free flow of capital and traffic and ideas, you're good with that, okay? But if you're only trained for a road to somewhere, you're petrified by the European Union. And so he paints this picture about how dramatic. Well, I don't think we have to think too long and hard about how there can be parallels to the populism of Brexit, to the populism at work in this country, and the divide that we're seeing. So this is a slightly different point than you're making, Scott, but it's in the same vein that there is, I think, a huge social impact of this that has gone under-discussed in this conference, that may be as needed as it's ever been in this country, that we need more people who are rubbing shoulders with each other, being educated together, who do English and poetry and art and philosophy, even as they do mechanics and culinary and the trades and the technical disciplines, and having them in the same hallways, at the same social activities, rubbing shoulders together, learning from one another. I think that's a civic imperative for me, and that's why this conference matters so much, and why I do think there ought to be some next steps here. And I love the ideas that have been shared that we think about a follow-on conference in 18 or 24 months, that we think about doing some additional research. One of the questions that came in was, will there be a participant list? Yes, we will send you a participant list. We will send some follow-up questions. I think we'll try to create a website that will have a kind of a summary selection of some of these presentations, and create some ways to continue to follow on with a conversation between now and the next 18 months, because I think there's a lot at stake here. I think there's a lot at stake for social justice. I think there's a lot at stake for civic health. And I think we have some answers. We don't have all the answers, but I think what we've seen today, we have some really compelling things that we're doing here that need more visibility, they need more expansion, they need more reality across America, and I think, we're the group to help do it. So with that, folks, please thank the panel, and thanks to all of you for a wonderful conference.